Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs has a lot in common with the previous technology film that Aaron Sorkin wrote, The Social Network, in that it is more concerned with the relationships in these quote-unquote great men's lives than what they invented themselves. In fact, this film, which is about 3 different product launches, doesn't really show the product launches. It just shows the behind the scenes and what leads up to the product launch, but never actually shows it. It's more about his relationship with Steve Wozniak, with John Scully, with his own daughter, and I don't know if it was his ex-wife or ex-girlfriend, and Andy Hertzfeld, and his assistant Joanna Hoffman, played by Kate Winslet. It's never really about him inventing stuff. It's just about him talking about how he's going to advertise and show off to his shareholders this stuff that he's worked so hard on. It's an interesting way to do technology, and I think it shows why Aaron Sorkin's so good at taking these Silicon Valley titans and making them human in a way and showing how they might have been geniuses, but they were also total assholes, but kind of what created that and what fed into that and what was important to them. When you think of a great person or someone who created all this stuff and you think of a biopic, you almost really want the biopic to be about like the cliche of them recording the great song or inventing that thing or having that aha moment. And Steve Jobs doesn't have that, but what Aaron Sorkin does with these films is he makes those parts the least important part of the film. Almost he makes the most important part all the other stuff that was going on throughout their lives, and that makes for much better drama than a straight biopic, which even Aaron Sorkin himself noted that after Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox story, he felt it would be hard just to make a straight biopic, and really a straight biopic of Steve Jobs would probably be boring, but this film isn't boring. It has a great flow to it. You almost don't feel like you're just behind the scenes in all these stage areas where he's walking and talking to people. It feels a lot more exciting than that, and mostly because it is kind of unpredictable, since it's more about these relationships and how he's hurt these people and how his own ignorance and assholeism has ruined his relationship with some of these people. It makes you think more about the relationships that were destroyed, ruined, and tampered with while all these great technological advances were happening. Behind the scenes of 3 product launches: the Macintosh computer in 1984, Steve Jobs' next computer company called Next, and the obvious failure of that, and then the third one being the iMac and his resurgence and comeback to Apple. The main relationship, really, besides Wozniak and John Scully, was a relationship with his daughter, who he refused to admit that he was the father of, and how all this craziness is going on behind the scenes right before he has these major product launches. When you hear the premise of this movie, it doesn't sound very exciting at all. It just sounds like a very boring, droll, very theatrical film. In theatrical, I mean in like live theater kind of a way, and movies used to have a lot more to do with that. Classic Hollywood films are more in the theatrical tradition than we do now. That's mostly because of everyone's idea of entertainment at that time came from live theater and vaudeville, and now obviously we're more postmodern in the fact that we're taking from movies, but it's really probably more to do with the fact that our main source of entertainment came from movies and TV, and before it came from live theater. But anyway, that's not important. The point is this takes from the great tradition of Hollywood using more of kind of a live theater idea, and Aaron Sorkin has written a few plays in his day. I've never seen an Aaron Sorkin play, but it almost feels like an Aaron Sorkin play in a way because of how well the dialogue flows. It flows so well, I honestly didn't realize how long this movie was until I left the theater. I looked at the clock on my phone and was honestly surprised because it moves at such a pace, it grabs you and it flows so well. You're not really thinking about how long you've been sitting there. It moves as well as a really well-made audience-pleasing blockbuster, and it reminded me of how good classic Hollywood could really be with doing these very big, very live theater inspired kind of movies. I think Danny Boyle's good at this. He's kind of done it before with a film that just takes place in one location with 127 hours, but in 127 hours when they'd kind of cut away and he'd have fantasy sequences or he'd think of his past, the difference between that and in this film when they cut to things that happened in the past, when they refer to things and they cut back and forth a a lot. In this film, it feels a lot more organic. In fact, it feels incredibly organic. I don't even really think about how we're breaking away and kind of trying to make this film a little more like cinematic than theatrical. It just fits so well because it's part of the story we need to see and to understand what's going on, so you don't really question it. In 127 hours, every time he cut away, I was questioning it. Now, certainly everyone's walking around in this film. There's a lot of movement, there's a lot of great dialogue, all sorts of things like that. But the cutaways certainly establish what's going on, what happened in the past, how we got there, what happened between the various product launches. Danny Boyle, who also apparently shot them all on different kinds of film stock. The first two were different kinds of film. When the last act, or when he was launching the iMac, is shot on digital. It's slight, but you will actually notice it. He does kind of point out the digital thing by having like digital fuzz right before that part starts. His little like weird kind of almost video art in the early 90s kind of sequences actually work a lot more organically in this, when he has the parts between the various, if you want to call them acts or whatever, or the various product launches. As much as this might feel like he's being more of a journeyman director and this is more of an Aaron Sorkin movie than a Danny Boyle movie, it almost doesn't feel like a Danny Boyle movie except when he does his video art thingies or whatever. I think it shows kind of the strength of him as a director, that he could mellow down and really just let this play as it needs to play. It's a really smart screenplay and an interesting screenplay, and even the way Danny Boyle uses music throughout it really heightens the film and really accents the dialogue and how great it is. Aaron Sorkin's really the star of this movie almost because it's so well written. I'm more of an Aaron Sorkin screenplay fan than I am with his TV shows. The way the dialogue rolls off the tongue, how eloquent all the arguments are. You're like, I want to have an argument like that. That'd be awesome. And instead you'd be like, you're stupid. Like, you never have an argument that well. And he even admits, like, no one really talks that way the first time around. And even the people who this was based on admitted, like, I mean, I said something like that, but it wasn't that good. It's definitely made in a way that you can tell it's a Hollywood version of itself. It's not trying to shy away from that. It's not trying to hide like it is. I did actually think this was one of Danny Boyle's better directed films I've seen in a long time. I'm not the hugest fan of Slumdog Millionaire, but I'd probably say, like, definitely since the mid-2000s, it's one of his better directed films, just because he kind of knew exactly when to bring out the Danny Boyle-ness and let this screenplay be the kind of movie it should be, really. And that it didn't let Steve Jobs go. It made him look like the tremendous asshole that he certainly was. Anyone who would take the mother of his child and then come up with an algorithm saying that 24% of all men could potentially be the father of this girl who is clearly his daughter, and then have it in Time magazine, is tremendously shitty. The way he treats people, his assholishness throughout it. They don't shy away from it, but they also don't shy away from that he did a lot of cool stuff and he was a really creative, interesting person, and why you would both think he's an amazing guy but also think he is the worst person ever. It gets the whole rock star vibe of him, but since Steve Jobs died, he's kind of like a saint or something, since it doesn't get into the latter half of Apple's success with the iPhone and how they really started to come back in the I mean, they came back before, but they really exploded in the 2000s. They kind of let the early success speak, and that was kind of the Steve Jobs I knew throughout the 90s. I noticed that had melted away, and I'm not saying we should just remember him for being a jerk, but this film seems to be able to get that, like, yes, he was a genius guy, yes, he came up with a lot of great ideas, and he was really interested in design, and that was part of what made Macs such a big deal, is because they look cool. You look at some of the other computers, they look ugly, they look cumbersome. When Macs came in, what a big deal that was, and it shows how well he showed them off. It's really almost more about Steve Jobs, how great he was at marketing, and a little bit about design, mostly about the man, and you kind of get like why people potentially hate him. Michael Fassbender does a really great job as Steve Jobs, who seemed like an odder choice when he was picked. Does it so well and so effectively, but can really show how he really wasn't paying attention to some of the issues he was having with these people. He was just thinking of the big picture. He responds to the mother of his child at one point. She says like how her and his daughter applied for food stamps today and were living incredibly poor while his Apple stock was worth over $400 million. And then he starts talking about how he donates Apple computers to schools. Like, that fixes it. Wasn't even thinking about her whatsoever. And the same with Wozniak and all those people. And I think Michael Fassbender was great at capturing that in such a way that you don't even really notice it until afterwards. You're like, oh my god, that was going on the whole time. Like, he plays it so well, it feels like you're almost with like a fully formed character. It's probably one of Michael Fassbender's best performances. It's definitely his showiest, but it's showy in a really efficient, amazing actor way, less in a shitty Oscar biopic way. In a lot of ways, this film gets to get away with a lot of things that normal biopics don't get away with, because they do things that are showy, that are mainly done in a showy way. They're not to make the film's flow go better. They're not to make the story go better. They're just to tug at your heartstrings and make you cry and care a little bit more. And Steve Jobs, this movie, it's hard to, am I talking about the character in the movie? I don't even know. But the point is, there's a reason for it. There's a reason for that in the movie. Fassbender's an interesting actor because he'll do big star vehicles, but he'll also do smaller indie stuff. And he really understands the kind of performance for the right movie. And in that way, he's almost like the anti-movie star, even though he's in like X-Men and he's going to be in Assassin's Creed and stuff. He's a very versatile actor. People recognize him and know who Fassbender is, but he doesn't have an exact Fassbender kind of performance. And this shows like how well he can morph into something that looks like incredibly challenging, but he does it at such an ease, it's insane, and he's incredibly captivating. There's a lot of press about Seth Rogen, and I certainly liked Seth Rogen quite a bit as Steve Wozniak, and I haven't seen him do too many dramatic roles before this, but the person who I think probably should get all the attention and potentially the Oscar nomination for supporting, if that happens, is Michael Stahlberg as Andy Hertzfeld, who is part of the original Mac team, and he was really good. I really like Michael Stahlberg. I think he shows what it's like to work with Steve Jobs, what it's like to know Steve Jobs, but also like how he was very much into computers, and he was kind of like the bigger dork that hid in the background, because Wozniak was obviously Steve Jobs' good friend. He was like this guy who he didn't really consider that much, but ends up kind of sneaking up on you in the end. And Kate Winslet as Joanna Hoffman. I love Kate Winslet. I think she's an amazing actress, and she's probably one of the greatest actresses of her generation. Her performance is really good, but her accent is not as good, because it starts off one way in the first part. And I know apparently they would rehearse for 2 weeks, shoot for 2 weeks, and then rehearse the next for the next product launch for 2 weeks, and then shoot it again. That's how they did it. But her accent changed visibly from the first one to the second one. She suddenly, I got more Swedish. I do not understand you, Steve Jobs. What the hell just happened? Like, are you serious right now? Did you go back to Eastern Europe between these two launches? Like, why did your accent change so dramatically? And then in the third one, it was kind of like almost back. I don't know what was going on with Kate Winslet's accent in this movie. She said Joanna Hoffman has a kind of a hard voice to imitate, so maybe that's it. I still think she did a really good performance. Despite having an accent that had no consistency, it was still a really good performance. Everyone's really great in it, including Jeff Daniels, who is almost like a veteran of Aaron Sorkin at this point and can say his dialogue so well. He's like the Sam Jackson of Aaron Sorkin. It's like second nature to him, but he's so good at it. I didn't love The Newsroom, but he is really good at saying that dialogue. When you're watching a movie like Steve Jobs, you do have to look at it in the kind of genre, I guess, if it's a genre of biopics, and think of how unique it is, and how most of it, the first two launches were failures, and it shows how long it took for Apple to really explode and become like the biggest company in the world and just completely take over and change our way of life. And Steve Jobs had that idea for a long time. It shows him becoming a better man and a more complete man and a more complete person that took him a while to do that. That you mostly just see the transition of him, seeing all these people confront him about various things. And some people have complained about that, but I thought the flow of it flowed so well. I didn't really think about it. They make a joke. What does everyone go to a bar 5 minutes before a launch and then come back and tell me what they really think of me? And that was very funny, because that is kind of how it feels. Almost everyone said like none of this really happened, but it's not really about that. Michael Fassbender doesn't look exactly like Steve Jobs. Most of these people don't look like the people they were playing and aren't saying things that these people would have said, but that almost doesn't matter. It's like it really captures that kind of idea. It captures that person. It captures that moment. And these people, what separates this from most prestige films is most prestige films want you to care about this person you'd never heard about before, and people maybe should know, and fine, I accept that. But with Steve Jobs, we already do care and we already do know, so this film is allowed to play in a lot of ways better than most films that are biopics or prestige pictures do. But what I think makes this film so much better is it plays more in those relationships. It doesn't think about how you don't know who he is and maybe you don't know this stray fact or whatever. It wants to capture the person and the attitude, and I think that's what makes this film such a more complete and thrilling experience, is I could get into it. I didn't have to go, oh, so that happened. There's a little of that. Certainly the Time magazine thing and how he would wouldn't admit that he had fathered this daughter. But for the most part, it's really more about the relationships, and that makes it far more fascinating than something that I probably could have read in a Wikipedia article. It understands more of what makes them tick rather than what they made, even if Steve Jobs liked you more for what you made than what made you tick. It understood what was really important for a movie, and it wasn't what you made, it really was what makes you tick and the relationships that are involved within that. So if you have seen Steve Jobs and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.